everyone. Ooh, wow, I'm really loud. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Room full of IT people. I know I made you uncomfortable moving in. I apologize, but thank you very much. Is everybody having a good time so far at TC? Yes. Learning lots, which is the goal. Excellent. I'm a hand talker. I am Stephanie Potter. I'm a senior product manager at Tableau, and I work with a team that builds functionality that makes it easier for people to self-serve when they run into problems with Tableau. So for server administrators, we do things like log uploading from the server and server crash reporting and things like that. So I also am joined here by Alan. Alan?
Hi, I'm Alan Dorhofer. I am Director of Product Development, and my team owns Tableau Server install and administration and configuration. And I've been working on that with that team for about 10 years now. Super excited to be here and to talk to you today about deploying Tableau Server. All right, so let's kick this off. So raise your hand if you're brand new to Tableau Server and you've never installed it before.
Woot!
Quite a few.
Right.
Great. Raise your hand if you're an administrator of a Tableau Server installation and you've been doing it for many years. Aha, gotcha.
Nice. Okay, so good mix.
One more. Raise your hand if your existing installation is more than one worker node. Okay, so most of the people that have been doing it. Gotcha. Well, good. So we'll get to definitely a lot of material for those of you new to installing Tableau Server. This is a great place to be for that. We'll also talk to some things that are new in 2018, and there may be some things if you've been administering Tableau Server for a while that we'll cover that you haven't thought about. So a great place to be. All right, so our agenda today is we're gonna talk about some case studies to kind of give you scenarios that you may be puzzling over yourself. And certainly if you haven't installed Tableau Server before and you're in charge of administrating it, this is the place to be. We'll also talk about what kind of the checklist to make sure that your deployment is super successful at whatever your goals in your company are. And then briefly, we'll talk about the architecture of Tableau Server and how it's changed a bit over time. And finally, what's new in 2018, relevant to deployment and to administration. So let's get going. We're going to start with a problem that this is a large-scale installation of Tableau Server, very large. This is a nine-node, nine-worker cluster at a large financial services customer that is successfully serving up visualizations at a high rate with hundreds, if not thousands, of concurrent users. They're using a whole bunch of caching. In fact, this slide is kind of an extreme version of hey, we recommend you look into caching. It helps a lot. You'll also note that they have some dedicated nodes to backgrounder processing, which each are only running 2, but I actually recommend you run a lot more than 2 for more parallel background processing. I'm not going to dive into the details of that yet, especially for those of you who are new. Today's talk isn't going to dive into capacity planning, exactly how many processes to be successful at this. Instead, we're going to basically doing a survey of the high-level topics you need to think about to make sure your overall Tableau deployment is successful at your org. This is a great example. So how did this company, this large financial company, get here to this successful install? First thing they had to think about was how were they going to architect the content and display content to users and organize it. So Tableau Server, they had to think about the options that Tableau Server provided for exposing workbooks and organizing workbooks and data sources to their organization. And so first they learned that there's the concept of the cluster, which I've mentioned before. So for those of you new to Tableau Server, Tableau supports clustering. You can certainly install it on one machine, which is a very common case within Tableau Server, and many of you are already doing that and will do that. One machine can serve up visualizations successfully to hundreds of users, even up to 1,000, depending on your concurrency, maybe more. But often customers will choose multiple nodes for high availability and to make a more scalable installation. And Stephanie will talk about scalability here later. So the cluster is the high-level, kind of largest abstraction. Each cluster is composed of workers, or nodes, we're starting to call them. They're just machines inside the cluster. Might be 1, might be 3, might be 9, might be more. And then And then once you log in on an individual, once a user logs in, they are logging into a site. And by default, that's the default site. And you can think of site as kind of the encapsulation of a tenant within Tableau Server. You don't have to use them. If you're just doing a simple installation of Tableau Server, which you're going to offer up workbooks to your organization, and everyone should be able to, within reason, if they have permission, see each other's workbooks, you're going to share across the whole company, then you probably want your entire company within one site. If, on the other hand, you have sub-organizations within your company that themselves sort of run independently as if they're smaller corporations or companies within your company, then site is the perfect thing for that. So conceptually and architecturally, sites divide content very, very strictly so that content by design is not shared between sites. They're essentially a tenant, and you log into a particular site, and that's all you see. And so within a site, you have projects. Projects are analogous to folders in an operating system. Projects might contain all your sales data, all your finance data, sandbox data, testing data, whatever, however, just like with an operating system folder, almost whatever subject you'd like. You can also nest projects within projects. And then within projects, that's just like a folder on an operating system. That's where we actually store the data. So workbooks, data sources, they're all stored within projects. So this kind of hierarchy of content options this company thought about, and they ended up using a few different sites for the use case I just described, and they use nested projects, and they have all sorts of interesting cases that are some cases shared, some cases siloed, and the result is that users feel safe to save, share, and collaborate across Tableau in a very natural, safe-feeling way. So then they needed to think about permissions, isolating and exposing content across those projects and sites and workbooks. And so they learned all about how permissions work in Tableau Server. That's a really rich area. In years past, and there may be, in fact, at this conference, talks specifically dedicated to how permissions work because they're very flexible. And so I'd encourage you to look at TC Lives for permissions talks, either this year or prior years, and look at recordings about how permissions work. But basically, this company learned that Tableau supports really flexible permissions, sort of similar to the way you can set permissions on a file in Windows or on Macs. You can set permissions individually for individual workbooks or data sources, and you can set permissions at a higher level at the project level. And when you do that, whatever publishes to that project gets the default permission set for that project. But you can also lock that project down so that you can't individually set workbook permissions or override them if you'd like to. So there's all sorts of options there. You can set up a folder or a project to have exposed permissions to everyone, but then you can go into a certain workbook and later say, but only 3 people can view this, and that's okay. And that's an example of how flexible permissions can be within Tableau Server. So you can integrate with Active Directory and LDAP. Like I mentioned, you can lock down at the project level. Data sources, in addition to workbooks, can be permissioned, very important. And users like site administrators, server administrators, project leaders, and owners can set permissions on content that they either own or are an administrator for. The next thing the company had to think about was data connectivity. And so from the deployment perspective, the reason they thought about data connectivity was to make sure that that install of Tableau Server had access to those data sources. So just like if you're using Tableau Desktop, and if your data source is Oracle or SQL Server or Redshift, you have to make sure that Desktop can actually connect to Redshift or Oracle, right? So you have to make sure that the firewalls are set up appropriately, that you have internet connectivity. Same thing goes for Tableau Server. So whatever data sources, all the workbooks that your organization is going to connect to, you have to think about from an IT perspective that server can actually access those data sources. And in some cases, your SQL Server, your Oracle, your Teradata, Vertica, what have you, might be on-premise right there, maybe in the same place. Maybe you're deploying to AWS, and maybe the data sources are right there in the cloud as well. But those are the things to think about, connectivity and the security associated with that connectivity to those data sources.
And watch out for firewalls.
And watch out for firewalls, that's right.
They can have impact.
They absolutely can, and we recommend that you use them.
Oh, yes.
Absolutely, but just make sure you're aware that they're on, so, because they often cause support cases, and it turns out to be the firewall was on. So, but as this company learned about what options existed for data connectivity, options like you can directly connect, as I mentioned. You can extract data from one of these data sources. You can do a combination of both. And you can publish shared data sources, which is basically the metadata around a connection to a data source. And that can be shared on Tableau Server. And permissions can be set on that. You can set friendly alias names for columns. You can update it and add columns. And all workbooks and users who are using that shared data source get that. It's a really powerful governance mechanism. And of course, permissions are key for those shared data sources as well. If you want everyone in your company to see one specific data source for all bugs or sales data, you could open it up completely so that everyone could read it, but no one could write to it, for example. Or if you want only the finance team should be able to see this particular sensitive finance data source in SQL Server, you can lock that down permissions-wise. The next thing they thought about was a topic I've been mentioning a couple times, which is self-service and governance. They go hand in hand. With permissions and with security to the data sources, this company thought a lot about how that they were going to govern and expose data sources to their users. So they set up some folders and potentially some sites so that everything was open by design to encourage people to connect to data that everyone should share inside the company and to just work with it. And so the permissions in those projects were set so that by default everyone could access them. Or they had folders for every individual user that they could write to, and by default everyone could read from to encourage sharing as well. And then they also, like I mentioned a few times, use both sites and folders to lock down permissions to subgroups within their organization that could only see them. Very important in order to make sure that only the right groups could see those data sources. And then they use things like certified data sources, which this very powerful thing. Part of governance is not just locking down data, but it's making sure that your users know to connect to the right data. So in a lot of organizations, there might be a data source for sales, and there might be 100 of them actually, and they're all sort of similarly named. Well, which one is the canonical correct one? Which is the one up to date? You can certify that data source so that it shows up first in the search results, and it's very clear that this is the one and only one you should be using. Next thing that they had to think about, very important to this company, was security, as it is to every company. Very important to a bank, of course. And so they ended up using all sorts of security options that Tableau offered. They learned that Tableau integrates, as I mentioned, with Active Directory. It integrates with LDAP user stores. It supports single sign-on technologies such as SAML. It supports, we'll mention this in a minute, but SSL certificates, but you can also configure client certificates on your users' machines that are running desktop so that they don't have to log in, they don't have to use SAML, but they use the client certificate, so kind of a two-way certificate situation there. Tableau Server supports Kerberos for automatic single sign-on login as well, and we'll talk a little bit more about you can take row-level security so that when you log into Tableau Server, interact with a visualization that's using a data source that supports Kerberos as well, that user's credential is passed all the way through, and they only get access to the row within that data source. Can you all still hear me? I have a pretty loud voice, so I'll just talk through it. And so they ended up using a combination of all of these things. And then they integrated with their AD to lock down the user that was running Tableau Server. A concept we call the run as user is a very important one. We recommend that you use a low credentialed run as user rather than a super user in AD or something like that, just for security reasons. But sometimes in the past, it was a common pattern for administrators to use a run as user, which had read access to certain commonly used data sources. And that way, any visualizations that were published to this server, because that run as user could connect to SQL Server and read certain data sources, it was very easy for people to share visualizations that way without having to embed their own credentials in the data source.
which is a good thing to do. But on the flip side, then you've got this process running with access to data, and that may not be good as well. So that's why you might want to look at Kerberos or SAML, and there are all sorts of other options there as well. And then this company definitely enabled SSL on Tableau Server. We recommend everyone enables SSL. We can't force that, so by default it doesn't do that because you have to provide a TLS certificate, but it is there, and we encourage everyone to use that for security. And then they learned that there's something called trusted tickets, which is an older technology within Tableau Server that allows for embedding visualizations into websites with a little bit of scripting, allowing automatic login and the ability to display visualizations on behalf of a user that's done via a ticket so that people didn't have to log in themselves. And so you could still do that. And the security associated with that was basically IP whitelisting. That's an option. And then you also can use things like SAML now so that the user doesn't even realize they're logging in, which is probably a better option than the old trusted tickets was. And then lastly, as I mentioned a few times, they lock down permissions to data using Kerberos in many cases, just to make sure that the right groups of people were accessing data and the wrong ones were not. And then the next thing the company thought about was how they were going to scale this. And I'll turn it over to Stephanie to talk a little bit about scale.
Thanks, Alan. So this is a different company that I'm going to talk about because every company is different, right? And so in this case, they are another fairly large company, but they only have about 1,000 users, not nearly as big as the financial services example we were just giving. So one of the things that they have that is very different is that they are going to run the majority of their deployment on VM clusters, which is great because Tableau absolutely supports that. What they need to think about as they are creating that, however, is provisioning those VMs. Because if you under-provision the VMs where you're going to be running your Tableau server, you are going to have performance issues that your users are going to feel and be impacted by. So, as you are thinking about the VMs, you need to think about, am I running anything else on it? Please don't. And if you have to, please don't. But if you have to, make sure that that is a really well-provisioned, hefty VM. And then also, you're going to need to think about, for these guys, lots of different authentication needs. Now, Alan did an awesome job of covering the various types of authentication that we do, so I'm not going to backtrack for that one. Once they got everything provisioned and set up, some of the things that they are going to need to do is monitor. Because if you've got multiple sites and multiple projects, which is really common, you're going to have a lot of different experiences for your users, and you want to know what's going on in all of your nodes, right? I mean, you guys are IT. You understand that information is power, and if you don't know what's happening on your server, you can't tell when things are going wrong or when things are going right. You have no baselines, you have no comparison points, nothing. So, the cool thing is that we have done some tools. And most of the tools that Tableau offers are at this point community supported. We run a GitHub from which we distribute all of our tools. And I'm going to give you a little quick overview for some of them. However, I highly recommend that you go out and you visit the GitHub repo that we've got, because it will walk you through all of the various tools. And really, you can download them. They've all got great user guides. They have a community forum attached to each of them. So if you have questions, you can go ahead and ask your questions. And both community members and Tableau staff do monitor those forums on a very regular basis. So the tools that I want to talk today, we have tools that work at the very broad level all the way down to the very granular level. I'm going to give a passing mention to TSM. Alan's going to talk about that a bit more later. TSM is the new UI that we have introduced with Tableau 2018.2, and it was the Linux backend and command line that was introduced with Linux in 10.5. So that allows a lot of UI interaction and web layer, which is great. But then if you move on to the system level layer, we've got a bunch of different tools. I heard an awesome analogy yesterday that I have to share because it really helps people remember. Tabmon is your Fitbit. So you want to know what's happening at your OS level. Are your disk I/O, is that going fine? Or are you getting a little low and tight on space? Or do you have enough CPU, enough RAM, all of that? Tabmon is your Fitbit. Uses the JMX counters, and we allow you to configure how often and how much data you gather, and then visualize it in a series of Tableau workbooks. We provide the initial workbook set, but we also provide the data, and it's stored in a repo so that you then can go ahead and do more analysis and build your own workbooks on top of it. So that's your Fitbit. And when you want to work with something that stresses it, you work with TabJolt. TabJolt is your treadmill. It is a load analysis tool. So TabJolt allows you to go ahead and simulate load on your servers and then get the diagnostics so that you can see what happens when that load is occurring. So when you use those two in conjunction, you've got a pretty good feel for some of the things that are going on in your server. And then we've also got process level monitoring, and we've got some error categorization through a tool called Scout. Scout is another one that will help you understand what's going on at the workbook level with your server. So if you, like I said, go to the repo and you look up, so it's under GitHub in the Tableau supported community tools, and I highly recommend that you go and look at tools. Because once you have your tools and you're up and running, then you can think about your scalability. And to be fair, you want to think about your scalability before you actually roll out as well. But scalability is an ongoing process, so you have to think about it all the time. Tableau Server is designed for incredible flexibility, which is great, and which is kind of scary, right? Because when you have lots of choices, well, oh dear, what if I make the wrong choice? That's part of the cool bit of Tableau, is that if it turns out the choice isn't exactly what you want, it's pretty easy to tweak, make a new choice. Sweet. So Tableau scales basically linearly, and it is designed to scale either up or out, depending upon what you're trying to do with it. When you think about how and why you would need to scale either up or out, you need to think about a couple of really fundamental questions. You need to understand who your users are. Are your users really divergent across all of your base? Meaning, do you have users who are going to be diving in and doing rigorous, lots of questioning, serious data analysis, really just asking lots and lots of questions of your data? Or do you have the majority of your users are actually consumers? You know, you've got a few people who've done lots of rigorous analysis, but then they're putting up dashboards, and people are checking these dashboards all the time. And both of these are totally legitimate scenarios. And you could have mixes anywhere in between there. And so as you think about who your users are, that impacts how you deploy your scenarios. Because if you have users who are going to be creating lots of extracts and refreshing those all the time, and if those extracts are big, that has a huge impact on your server. So understanding who your users are and how they're going to use the data and how they're going to use these tools is fundamental to the success of your server performance. So to give you some examples of this, we've built a little grid here, and up in the top corners, you see people who are accessing lots of data all the time really quickly, and they need constant data. Some of them need really refreshed data all the time. Some of them, they access it a lot, but it's going to be pretty static data. So with those two scenarios, you could provision differently. You're going to need a lot more RAM and CPU and just raw horsepower for the folks who are getting lots of extracted data and lots of analysis all at the same time. Whereas for those folks who need less extract data but are still accessing it, you don't have to worry quite so much about the scale. And then you also think about the other folks on the other end, which is if you're only doing, you have a few users and they're pretty well spread out across the various roles that they're occupying, you can have a lower provision server. You might not need as many clusters. You might be able to just scale up a single node and be totally solid. HA is another thing you think about when you're thinking about scalability. If you want better HA, you can scale across multiple clusters for failover options. So when you put scalability thoughts in conjunction with the monitoring, then that helps you predict what you're going to need as you're going through the future. So you think about scale from the beginning, and then you revisit it time over time. Alrighty. So then, another aspect of this, whoops, it didn't go as far as I wanted it to. Another aspect of this is query caching. Query caching is something that we introduced in order to help kind of mitigate load options on the server as it's happening. So if you have some of those high usage and really high involvement people who are asking questions of their data all the time, they're not just looking at reports, they're filtering reports and they're creating new sources and things like that, then every time that they're querying stuff, they're hitting the server, which is great, except when they're all doing it at the same time. Because then you have impact and load. And so that's where caching comes in. And you, as the owners of your server, have the ability to configure your caching so that you can distribute your load and help really solve some of your performance problems. And then you can also do things like isolate your backgrounder nodes and make sure that when you're scheduling refreshes and things like that, you've looked at your monitoring and you see when your refreshing happens. And so if you know that your refreshing happens during a certain 3-hour chunk of the day, most commonly, you make sure that your schedules and your extracts and your backgrounders are all provisioned nicely during those 3 hours. It helps to distribute the load. And the caching helps to even things out for during the times when those spikes happen. All right, and I'm going to turn it back over to Alan for now.
Thanks, Stephanie. Yeah, and so regarding kind of capacity planning and scaling out, the server installation guide for administrators has sections that talk about that in more in depth, so I'd encourage you to look at that. There also have been a couple of talks at this conference in regards to scaling Tableau Server and capacity planning, so I would search for those, and if you, they may be coming later, or if they've already been, check out TC Lives and watch the recording, very important talks.
And I forgot, there's a scalability deep dive white paper that I highly recommend, and that is available on the site tableau.com now. So.
I do recommend that you read about that because by default it can be confusing just how many processes do we need for this and how many processes for that. And the product doesn't tell you that. In the future, we'd love for it to say, use this template for backgrounder refreshing if you do that a lot. Use this for a lot of vizzes, but it's not built in, so you do need to read about it and learn about what the options are. So how did these two use case companies roll out successful deployments at their organizations? And both of those companies are very large, but all the lessons apply to a small installation as well. They started by learning about how they're going to lay their content out. What were the options in terms of exposing it and organizing it so that it was safely and visibly accessible to the right groups of people. They used and learned about permissions and isolating content to do just that. Then they learned about all the options for data connectivity. First and foremost, just to make sure that the server could actually access the data sources that they're getting, but also in terms of educating their users in terms of what's possible with things like shared data sources. They learned about the difference between governance and self-service and how actually they're complementary. So an organization may want to lock down data sources to just the right groups and be very strictly governed in terms of access, and other organizations may want everything to be open and shared by default. Most organizations are somewhere in between and mix those two models, and we support both. Security is very, very important to every company. Tableau supports all sorts of security use cases. We went through that, but it's good to know what the options are. There is a security in-depth talk tomorrow afternoon. I encourage you to sign up for that. Tableau Server Security in Depth, I believe it's called. Stephanie talked a lot about open source monitoring and management tools, things like TabJolt for load testing, TabMon for monitoring. There's built-in JMX counters. There's built-in status tools into the product itself, so there's a lot of options for that. And then lastly, we talked about kind of the two dimensions of scalability, how often you're accessing data and how often you're refreshing it. And so based on that use case, you may want to provision a lot of caching or not, and so it's good to understand the options there. All those facets at the highest level go into designing a successful deployment, whether it's for 50 users or 50,000. It's all the same set of challenges there. So next I'm going to talk about, just briefly, for those of you, again, brand new to Tableau Server, as well as those of you who are interested in differences, what the architecture looks like. And so at the highest level, there's a process that we call the gateway, which typically in a cluster, there's multiple gateways running, one on each machine. And gateway internally under the hood is just literally Apache web server off the shelf that's shipped with Tableau Server. And it's responsible for all HTTP requests from all clients, whether it's a mobile client, whether it's desktop, whether it's the tab command utility, or most commonly, HTTP browser requests. It's also Apache, the gateway, that does built-in SSL handling if you're not using your own SSL terminating proxy in front, which you can also do as well. Gateway's job is also to load balance amongst the processes behind the gateway, both on that particular machine as well as the processes on other machines. And so the gateway is very important. In the first slide of the financial services company, you may have noted that that company had a node that was just running gateway or gateway and backgrounder. And so that's kind of a way to ensure you have a highly available system with multiple Apaches, although you can also just rely on the fact that it's running on each of your worker nodes as well. Beneath the gateway, there's the content services layer. That's the bread and butter of what Tableau does. We have something called the application server process. That is the process that internally we call Viz Portal. And if you actually look at the processes, you'll see the name Viz Portal associated with the application server. And it's responsible for logging in, for all permissions, for browsing projects, for browsing data sources. So basically anything you're doing other than interacting directly with the visualization in terms of the user browsing around is handled by the application server. That's Viz Portal. So if you're anticipating an enormous amount of browsing and searching, you might want to run nodes that run more Viz Portal processes, for example. There's a search server that actually is responsible for providing the content directly to that application process we just talked about. Under the hood, that's literally the Solr search service, just off the shelf, Solr. And so it does things like index workbooks, index users. When you search for workbooks inside Tableau Server, it's hitting the search server internally, and that's why when you're browsing around, content is very quick, because it's all indexed via the search server. VizQL Server is probably the most important process in Tableau Server. It is literally what handles all visualization, loading, as well as interactions. You can kind of think of VizQL Server as the server version of what Tableau Desktop is doing. In fact, a lot of the same code is running within VizQL Server on server. So if your primary reason for having Tableau Server is visualizations, which is the typical case, you'll definitely want to pay attention to, do you have enough VizQL Server nodes running? Each individual VizQL Server process is capable of handling a lot of load. It's a very highly concurrent, multi-threaded application, but we do recommend that you run a couple of them for high availability. And certainly, once you max out the resources on a given machine, then think about another node running a couple of more VizQL servers to scale linearly, as Stephanie mentioned before. And then we have our data server process, which is responsible for handling up all interactions with shared data sources. So when you're interacting with a shared data source, it's essentially the data source target that serves up queries itself from things like Tableau Desktop or web authoring sessions for shared data sources. And so if you're using a lot of those, make sure you have the appropriate number of data server processes running in your cluster. And then Also along the data lines, we have the process called Hyper, which we introduced relatively recently, last year or so, 2 years ago officially. And it takes the place, for those of you who have been around a while, the old Tableau data engine. That's now called Hyper. And it's still the extract engine for Tableau Server. It's just a new and improved version. It's a very fast in-memory column store-based process that is optimized for Tableau Server queries, or Tableau queries in general. It's also optimized for extract refreshes, for creating extracts very fast. And so if you're using a lot of extracted data sources, make sure you have the appropriate number of hypers running. There may actually be hyper-specific talks at this conference. I know there have been in the past, so take a look at either TCC 17 or this year. That's an entirely large subject. There's a lot to learn about how to isolate hyper if you end up having a lot of extract workloads and you're doing some heavyweight querying. The hyper team recommends that you try to put that on a separate machine, but you don't have to. I keep mentioning you should set up a separate machine for this and for that, and for those of you wondering, well, I'm just planning on installing it on a single machine and hoping it works. It does, absolutely. You don't have to isolate these processes. If you're planning on deploying to a few hundred users at an organization, a single machine, as long as it's not an underpowered VM that meets our recommended requirements for production, will be able to handle your usage just fine. When I'm saying isolate hyper or isolate backgrounder, that's when you've kind of moved beyond that 500-person user kind of scenario or 100-person concurrent, and you're starting to grow bigger and bigger. That's when we give you the flexibility of moving things to their own machines. And then Stephanie mentioned caching. So we have a cache server within Tableau Server as well. Under the hood, that's just the off-the-shelf Redis caching process, which you may have heard of. And then beneath those kind of application service layers, we have what's called our repository and file store. The repository is where we store all metadata about Tableau data. Metadata being things like the list of users, all the permissions associated with them, the list of projects, basically all the kind of content that you browse around and search for with our search server is persisted in our repository, which internally is nothing more than Postgres database. So Tableau Server ships Postgres internally.
And one thing to note, if you decide to run TabJolt or TabMon, please don't utilize the server's Postgres as your file store for those tools, because they will not play well together over time.
Yep.
You will slow down your user's experience in ways that you don't want. So luckily, they ship with their own version of Postgres, and you can install those too.
Good tip, yep. And it is a database, it's Postgres, so you have the option of setting up a replicated secondary node of that. It's not required, but if you want an HA situation for this repository, you have that option. And then there's the file store related processes, which are the Tableau specific processes that handle kind of the abstraction between our VisQL server and application server and the underlying file storage, whether that's just the file system mounted locally or a SAN or any storage solution that the Tableau server thinks the operating system is just a volume for. We're also working on extending that to support things like S3 and AWS, but today it's limited to storing things on volumes that the OS believes are local, but don't have to be. A SAN could be remote, but as long as you can mount it as a drive, then it works fine with Tableau. And then lastly, and somewhat new, although we had different versions of these in previous versions, with, as Stephanie mentioned, with Linux with 10.5 and with Windows with 2018.2 and later, we rolled out Tableau Services Manager. And there's a group of processes at that layer, things like the controller that serves up administrative requests from the administrative UI or the command line or REST APIs for administrators, and processes that coordinate communication amongst these things. We call that our coordination service, which under the hood, by the way, is just Zookeeper, for those of you familiar with that kind of technology. And then there's various agent processes. All of this works in coordination to allow you to do things like install Tableau Server, initialize it through the browser, or from the command line tool, or from a REST API. Change configuration settings, restart Tableau, stop it, run zip logs, all the administrative things for those of you who've used Tableau before that used to use tabadmin for, or tab config, have been replaced by Tableau Services Manager, and I've got a slide on that. We'll talk a little bit more in detail on that in a second. And so that's the architecture, that's the stack. It's stayed the same for most of the past 10 years for the most part. Things like Hyper have changed. Under the hood, we've gone from a Ruby-based code base to an entirely Java-based code base over the years. It's gotten much more scalable on an individual machine. Like I mentioned, we just completely revamped the administrative plane, but really the architecture hasn't changed too much.
However, we have all sorts of new things that have shown up in 2018. And I'm going to give you a bit of a talk about those, simply the ones that are relevant to the administration changes. So, Linux. How many of you all are Linux shops? Excellent. How many of you are thinking about potentially being a Linux shop? Yeah? Okay. So the good news is, we're here. And it's going well. Actually, about somewhere above 25% of our users are now running their servers on Linux, so we know it's going well in the real world.
As is Tableau Public and Tableau Online.
Yes.
All on Linux too.
Mm-hmm. So we have proof of scale and proof of utilization, and it's great. Everybody's having a good time on them. We also work well with the various cloud platforms are also available. Well, not so much Azure, but AWS on Linux is a thing. So that arrived in 10.5, and it is continuing now. The tools that I talked about, the majority of those can be run from a Windows machine and pointed at the Linux servers. We are working or looking at ways to extend tooling for Linux over the coming years. So,
and just a note on Azure, there's nothing preventing us from you can today run Tableau Server on Windows and Azure, even on Linux, but we've been investing a bit more in AWS in quick starts and that kind of thing. So there are a few edge cases around licensing and things that make it a little bit difficult in Azure, but it does work.
Thank you. I had forgotten that they
Sure.
provisioned that.
Yep.
All right. And so Tableau Services Manager is the new management system from the web, which is great. Background job management. One of the things that people have really asked us over the years is, why do I have to stop my Tableau server to make any changes? So we are now introducing hot topology for a couple of things, including backgrounders, which means that if you are scheduling your tasks and understand that here's your set of hours when backgrounder is going to be used, you can hot swap in more background tasks without actually taking down your server. And the crowd goes, yay! I know, you guys who are new, you don't understand the pain, but the rest of you probably do.
You can do that with VisQL servers as well. It's just
Yes,
those two processes for now, more coming.
And then we've also increased the compatibility between workbooks and server. So in past versions, there have been challenges where if your users are using a desktop version, which was not compatible with the server version you are running, there were challenges. And now we've solved most of those. We have Save As for both workbooks and data sources, and it allows you to upgrade and downgrade as you need it, which means that your server and your desktop users can have multiple options to run and still be compatible, which is great. The other thing that we've done with Tableau Services Manager that we've introduced is log management from the browser. So a lot of you who are running air-gapped scenarios or things where you may not have easy access to the actual machine, you can now use your browser to log into your Tableau Services Manager, so long as you are an admin on the box. You still have to have those permissions. And then you can handle all of your log management from that UI. So if you need to download the logs for your analysis, you can download it to your machine. If you need to, in fact, upload logs to Tableau Technical Support, how many of you have ever had to upload logs to Tableau Technical Support? Is it fun? So we're hoping that we have made your life easier. Starting in 2018.2 with Tableau Services Manager, you can now use your UI to check a few buttons, and it will automatically take your log set, parse it out into packets, make sure it's encrypted, send it up. directly into LogShark, and then all of that is attached to your technical support case. So makes it easier, and you don't have to worry about any of the challenges that come in an air gap scenario. So those are some of the new for 2018 features that are specifically related to server. And then we have Tableau Services Manager, deep dive.
And like I mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit more about TSM, although I would encourage you to check out a really great talk that happened yesterday, which the entire hour went into depth about Tableau Services Manager. Check that out on TC Live, the recording of that, or hopefully some of you got to see that already. But for those of you who didn't, we've mentioned a few times that we've revamped the entire administrative experience starting in 2018.2 and 10.5 for Linux specifically. And basically we rewrote tab admin, which is the command line interface for administrating Tableau Server, and we rewrote tab config, which was this Windows dialog that allowed you to configure Tableau Server. And we replaced it entirely with a command line, API, and importantly, web UI-based experience, which is a multi-tier architecture with a controller. So you no longer have to be on that machine to run tabadmin to do things like start, stop, or reconfigure things. Now you can just log into the browser wherever you are, as long as you have configured SSL to that endpoint correctly. And log in, and you can start Tableau Server, you can stop it, you can change configuration, you can manage licenses, you can change topology, you can add backgrounders, you can remove them. Basically everything you used to use tab config or tabadmin, you can do with the UI now. There are a few things that actually can only be done by the command line, which is also brand new. The command line itself was renamed from tabadmin.exe to tsm.exe, and so tabadmin.exe is no longer in existence in 2018.2 and forward. TSM replaces that. The command line has a very, very rich built-in help system on Linux, little plug for Linux. If you like Linux, TSM supports tab completion, so if you type TSM set or TSM maintenance and hit tab, it will autocomplete and give you all the options possible. So it's really kind of great environment for administrating Tableau Server. So, like I mentioned, all this administrative functionality is exposed via a UI, via the new command line, and under the hood, it's all using the same API, which is also in alpha, which you could hit today, and over the time we'll be documenting that more. But literally this REST API is what the command line and the UI uses. So you should be able to automate all this functionality using the API if you'd like to, or automate it via the command line, or not automate it at all. It's your choice, and just use the UI in the web browser. One of the great things is that there's no there's no requirement to have a single designated main instance in the cluster, other than for Postgres primary and secondary. That hasn't gone away. You've got a primary Postgres. But ignoring that for a minute, we used to require that you designated this machine as where you run tabadmin from, for example, the main concept. That went away. You can, anywhere a worker's installed, you can run TSM. It doesn't matter which node is which. And in the future, I'd like to see us allow you to install the TSM command line tool anywhere, because it's just a very thin client. So that architecture is completely changed. And so hopefully you'll get a lot of enjoyment out of TSM. It's enabled things like, in addition to being a cross-platform administrative experience, which was important for making Linux work, it's also enabling us to do things like hot topology changes, what Stephanie mentioned. It's because of TSM that you can, on the fly, add backgrounders or remove them and apply those changes without restarting server. Same thing with VizQL servers. That's all a TSM artifact. And over time, we're going to add the ability to add nodes on the fly and to expand without having to restart the cluster as well. And over time, TSM will allow us to change settings on the fly. Things like changing log levels or changing this particular flag without having to restart the whole server, because we know that's a pain point. Every time you change something in Tableau Server historically, it requires a restart. A lot of things still do, but over time, TSM is the path forward in that regard to make everything configurable dynamically, and we're very excited for that.
And one thing to note, for those of you who are upgrading to 2018.2, because TSM is such a big change, it does impact how you administer your server, and some of the commands, as we've mentioned, have changed. I highly recommend that you read some of the installation guides and actually, take the time to do some reading, because it will make your life much easier.
Cool. And then we've got about 10 minutes left. So if there are any questions, please ask away.
Okay, so the question was, where can you get more information about the backgrounders hot swapping? That will be in the 2018.3 manual and user guides, and those are coming up very shortly.
There also was a backgrounder talk yesterday. I think it was Tuesday. So if you look for the recording of that in TC Live, it was specifically about backgrounder and the upcoming release.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, that's it.
Do you want to
Yeah,
repeat the question?
so we've had, the question was, when you set up high availability for a repository, and you have a primary and a secondary, the question was, is it necessary to run manually a command to switch over to the secondary if in the case of a failover, or when you need to? The answer is no. For years now, and TSM is no different, we've supported automatic failover for Postgres to the secondary when needed. Now, how long it takes to fail over is just dependent on the situation, but it is intended to be automatic, and failover should happen once the system detects that the primary is in a bad state, and it eventually will fail over and restart processes. And there will be a period of time when a Tableau server appears to be down because it's restarting, but it will pick itself up and continue going without intervention. Yeah, so that's a great question. There's two main differences between Windows and Linux Tableau Server, drivers and fonts. And so you're asking a great question. Not all fonts are available at all on Linux. Our kind of users have gotten used to the large set of fonts available by default in any Windows installation. And in Linux, that's not the case. However, we do ship a standard set of Windows licensed fonts, or fonts that are more traditionally associated with Windows, like Arial and things like that, with Linux. So a lot of them are covered. There are definitely some gaps there, and that is something to be sensitive about. And so, first of all, over time, we may end up licensing a few more. There are also ways to make sure that your Linux system has other fonts installed. So there are various open source Linux packages that have nothing to do with Tableau Server, which if you install them, and we recommend that, and there's the documentation talks about that, you can make sure that you've got like CJK related fonts, international fonts that don't exist by default, kind of Windows-centric fonts. They're all available open source that you can install beforehand, and that will greatly reduce the friction there. But it is definitely something you should think about, because your users are typically using Tableau Desktop on Mac or on Windows, and they're using a set of fonts, and then they publish it to server, and if those fonts aren't there, it'll have to fall back to a font that's close to it, and that may look different. And so that's definitely something to work through. We can't solve all those problems automatically. So it's a very good question. And then the other difference is database drivers. Most drivers are supported on Linux, but not all of our database vendors have Linux drivers. So there's some things like SQL Server Analysis Server cubes. For that specific case, there's just no driver available on Linux for that. There's a small set, and if you look at the documentation, you can see the exact list. For the most part, all the common ones are supported, though.
In that case, like if it is not supported, is there any generic code that can be used?
In a lot of cases, JDBC or ODBC will work, yes.
And there was a question back there.
Question around active-active scenario. If you're talking about HA, right? Is there any future roadmap or any customers trying to do the active-active scenario?
The question is, are there any future scenarios where we will support active-active with Tableau Server? And are you talking about with Postgres specifically? With the
Not Postgres, let's say the application, the environment, right? Let's say we have one primary and one secondary. So we want to be able to allow users to go either to the primary or secondary. Backgrounders getting synced in, let's say any content getting synced in, so those kind of scenarios.
Oh, so okay, so because we actually support that today.
Yeah.
If you have a multi-node cluster, and if you have backgrounder and BizQL server and data server processes running on all of them, and the gateway detects that one of the nodes isn't operating, it will just route requests to the others, and things will continue to work.
Sorry, my question is more around different data centers. So one would
Okay.
be in one state, the other
Right.
is in state.
Right, multi-cluster support. So sort of like cluster synchronization or disaster recovery scenarios and automatic replication. Great question. We don't have an out-of-the-box solution for this, but Stephanie mentioned that some of our customers, many of them quite frankly, have multiple clusters installed, and they're using tools like tab command to script basically moving content around on a regular basis. We don't have built-in replication amongst clusters or multi-replication support. We would like to put that in a roadmap eventually to support that. But there are definitely ways that both with the REST API for publishing as well as tab command that you can already synchronize content to some degree if you're willing to do the work. And internally we do that. We have other customers that are doing that. And the other thing is that people have a cluster, in kind of standby mode. And as long as they can get that snapshot of their database and their extracts or the backup itself from Tableau shipped over there on a reliable basis, at least they can restore that and bring it up within some number of hours. So.
Is it possible to get in touch with some of those customers just to understand how they are doing it?
Absolutely. So if I would suggest going down to the Data Village, the Tableau Labs IT kiosk. There's various folks there that can talk to you, and hopefully they can get you in touch with the right customers. So.
Yeah, so if anybody doesn't know, the Data Labs area in the village is staffed entirely by folks who work in the Tableau development organization. So we have all sorts of people who can answer good questions there.
Other one?
Does Tableau have plans for rolling out support for containerization, Docker, Kubernetes?
The question was, does Tableau have support for supporting containerization in the future? We are investigating that now. So that's definitely something that we're interested in as we host our own SaaS service for online. We're already using containers for things that aren't built into the shipping product. We're also looking at container support for the shipping product as well. The challenge there is that, as you may know, the container world works great in the Linux ecosystem. Not as great yet in Windows, but Microsoft is adding container support to Windows Server 2016. Hopefully, they also add things like Kubernetes support, because it's not just Docker, it's the whole ecosystem on top of Docker, like Kubernetes and things like that. It's definitely something that we're actively looking at and very interested in. So will we add support? It's almost guaranteed. Will it be the most common way to deploy? We'll see, because we don't want to have an entirely different product for Windows as per Linux, but we'll see how that works.
Are there any configuration options or roadmap stuff for isolating sites to their own workers?
Great question. Not exactly, but there are definitely on the roadmap more flexible ways to import and export sites. So we have a tool called Site Import Export today specifically that allows you to take just a site, export it, and then put that onto its own machine. But that would be a separate installation of Tableau Server as opposed to what you're describing, which is like isolate a site to a specific machine or group of machines, and it's a good feature request. So.
Are you guys doing anything? So I don't have anything yet, okay? So.
Oh, great, welcome aboard.
In your SaaS product or looking at future support so that when I'm building my hypers or anything else like that, I can use more of like a PaaS service rather than being so CPU constrained, right? So like typically how I'm doing these things in other BI modeling tools, I can scale up to 100 to 200 CPU, right? So.
A PaaS service, meaning like a hybrid, sorry, it was a question, do we support kind of a hybrid SaaS and on-premise model that we can scale out to SaaS, or?
Just so like right now I have to have a physical machine that constrained to 16 cores, right? So like my
I see, yeah. So definitely on our roadmap is what we're calling auto-scaling. So we want Tableau Server to know when it needs more resources, and to certainly notify the administrator. And when enabled, if you're in AWS or some appropriate cloud environment, just spin up more instances and spin them down when they're not necessary. That's in our roadmap. It's not in there today, although with this hot topology change, you can sort of do that with background or with processes as soon as we add the ability to add worker nodes dynamically as well.
You can do it in the processes too.
Yes, yes, yes.
Yes.
We are trying to move like 10.4 into, we are migrating into AWS, so if I wanted to go into the plan is to go in 2018, so which shall I, the 2018 dot, which version should I start to?
Are you on Linux or Windows? So, and are you going to stick with Windows?
Yes.
Okay. I mean, we always recommend going with the most recent version.
And that does include the most recent maintenance version. I highly recommend. Maintenance versions are good.
Well, so 2018.3 will be coming out shortly. And so we recommend going with the most recent maintenance version of that once you actually decide to pull the trigger. So I would recommend testing with 2018.3 when it's released. And then once you're ready to go to production, use the most recent maintenance version of that.
Okay, but you mentioned about the DSM coming in, so you can issue the stop command in any of, so currently with 10.4 versions and everything, I need to go to your primary and then issue a stop command. So DSM, I can catch it, so it's like I can issue the stop command in the web UI in any, if it is configured.
That's correct. Yeah, the web. So from your phone, from any browser, as long as you have access and you have a login, you can stop the whole. That's the great thing, is kind of the remote management without having a remote desktop to it. So.
And also the log feature, I can send a log to Tableau, is it like 28.3 is coming up?
That's 2018.2 it came out in. And actually from Linux, it was available from the command line starting in 10.5. Yes.
Back in August, we upgraded from 10.5 directly to 2018.2. That's just a 1 month release of that. But the instruction on the last step, upgrade script, that step we pretty much stuck on there for 1 hour and then did not go on. So then we researched on the web how other people get through with that, and then basically did a clean install.
Okay.
So I just wanted to know if any other customer has the same issue.
We have run into that, and quite frankly, Alan's team did a lot of work in the maintenance releases that have happened subsequent to the .0 to get us past that, because that, unfortunately, with the variety of customer deployments, we can't always test and predict against every deployment possibility. And so when we found that there were customers who were running into that, we immediately put out a fix.
Yeah,
So yes, you were not alone in that, and we apologize
Yeah.
for that experience. But thank you, because it helped us find the problem.
Yeah, sorry about that. But in 2018.2.1, we fixed some SSL issues. In 2018.2.2, we fixed a handful of issues that caused the problem you're talking about. And so we recommend that you try 2018.2.3 and forward. Hopefully we've got all those issues that you faced there ironed out, and we don't see those again. Longer term, we're also trying to avoid you just seeing stuck at 92%, right? And just asking what's happening. And instead, very specifically, plumbing through the multi-tier architecture, the specific error from that log file, so you don't have to go randomly finding that process, because we know that's a little bit difficult. So.
Yep. All right. Well, thank you, everyone, for joining us, and I hope that you have a wonderful time for the rest of your TC week.
Thank you so much.